Since the COVID-19 pandemic, school absence rates have soared. They're now nearly double what they were pre-lockdown. This week I speak with Becky Brooks, who is an education policy advisor at Adoption UK. We discuss how many families feel they're being forced out of the education system by schools who simply can't meet their children's needs anymore. Becky works with children who are at the sharp end of childhood adversity and trauma, but we talk about how high the trauma rates amongst children are now. Around 47% of children will have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, and all of them have lived through a pandemic and a lockdown, and many more are experiencing trauma caused by the cost of living crisis. So we will be talking about the intersection between that trauma and special educational needs. And although there will be a strong adoption and fostering slant to this episode, I think it will be of interest to many more people. So enough from me, let's now hear from Becky. Thank you, Becky, for joining me today. And we're going to have a chat about adoption and its intersection with special educational needs. So I think this will be of interest to both adoption families, but should still be of interest to families who have children with special educational needs too. So Becky, you're from Adoption UK, and I wonder if you could just start off by telling me briefly what Adoption UK does.
Hi, thanks, Esther. Yeah, Adoption UK is a national charity supporting adoptees, adoptive families, and all those actually who are affected by care experience who were previously in care. So we also offer support and advice to kinship families and others who are raising children who have previously been in care. We What I do at Adoption UK is my job title is Education Policy Advisor, which is a mystifying title for me because I used to be a teacher, and when I was a teacher, I understood what everyone's job titles meant. But out in the wide world, some of the job titles are a bit confusing for me. But what that essentially means is that I spend an awful lot of time analysing and looking at government policy with regards to education, and in particular with regards to care experienced and previously looked after children, trying to understand what is available to them, what supports are out there, and how general policy in education might impact on children who've experienced time in care. And also then trying to explain that in an understandable way to parents, carers, education professionals, and anybody, frankly, who will listen to me for even 5 minutes.
Your personal background has sort of drawn you into this job. I wonder if you could just share as much as you want to about that, which led you to this role now.
Yeah, sure. So for a long time, I was a secondary school teacher. That was my dream career when I was a child. I don't know if that makes me a strange child, but it's what I always wanted to do. And I graduated a long time ago now. I went into secondary school teaching. I have taught in big comprehensive schools. I've also taught in very small independent schools, including abroad. So I've got an interesting overview of the kinds of things that the people experience in different types of schools. Subsequent to that, I actually went to live in Romania for 2 years and worked with the Romanian Children's Charity, which specifically supported adolescents and young adults who'd been raised in Romania's institutions, what we would call orphanages, but they're not really orphanages. And then when I came back to the UK, I became a foster carer and subsequently became also an adoptive parent. And I've been working at Adoption UK, combining, I think, all of these influences
Yeah,
for the
sounds
past,
it.
oh goodness, about 7 or 8 years now.
Yeah. So as an ex-teacher, I'm curious, how long ago were you teaching?
Quite a while, I have to
Yeah.
admit that.
So when you look at the education system now, like, what do you think of it as an ex-teacher? Would you want to go back into it
No.
now?
So I would say that in some ways things are the same. The bread and butter of teaching is the same. The motivations of people to go into teaching is very similar. What families want out of education and what children want out of education doesn't really change enormously. Although I would say that I think there are fundamental questions we ought to be looking at in the UK about the nature of education, what we think school should be for, what we think education should be for, why are we educating children and young people, to what end? Because I don't think everybody necessarily has the same goals in mind when it comes to that. But other things, frankly, have changed beyond all recognition. I keep in a lot of contact with people who are currently working in education. And yeah, from very practical things in the classroom to, for example, I never used an interactive whiteboard. I was pre-interactive whiteboard, so that gives a clue of how long ago it was since I stopped teaching. But when I speak to teachers now and hear about the demands on them in terms of bureaucracy, paperwork, just the fact that you can be emailed at any moment by a parent. I mean, that wasn't something that we dealt with back in the day when I was teaching in school. So I think the landscape, both in terms of practical what goes on in schools, but also the accountability around schools has changed significantly since I was in education. And all that really needs to be taken into account when we're trying to have a sort of holistic view of how best to support children with special educational needs, and particularly in my work, those who've experienced childhood maltreatment, abuse, neglect, loss, moves around the care system, and a number of other adverse early childhood experiences.
It's interesting what you say about that accountability, because I know there's this sort of narrative at the moment that parents are being too demanding, particularly parents with children who have special educational needs, adopted children. Um, I mean, I know you're not in the sector now, but do you think parents are getting more demanding? And, maybe it's right that we are getting to more demanding because we want to hold them accountable.
I think this is really a very, very complicated subject. So I'm going to try and be careful what I say because I don't want to summarize things and lose all the nuance in the summary of it. I don't think it's wrong for parents to demand the full-time suitable education that their children are entitled to. I think that's a totally reasonable thing to want. So demanding that is not being demanding, it's just being a parent. Um, for full disclosure, I should mention that I have chosen to electively home educate my children. So they've never been to school. Really, as parents, ought to be in a position where it's okay for us to challenge what goes on in schools. And if that means asking for an HCP, if that means taking the local authority to tribunal, if that means any of that, then that should be acceptable for parents to do. Having said that, I also think that schools are sometimes between a rock and a hard place with this. One of the things that's been really noticeable to me over the past, let's say, 10 years, has been, I mean, certainly when I look at what's supposed to be on the national curriculum for children of my own children's age now, as compared to what I was used to teaching and what I would have expected primary school children to have learned when I was a teacher X number of years ago, it's certainly very different. There were definitely things on the primary maths curriculum, for instance, that were previously taught at Key Stage 3. There are definitely things getting pushed down and down and down. And I think there's been, in the drive to rise standards, I think there's a tendency to kind of think that, well, if it's good for a 30-year-old to learn this, it must be even better for an 8-year-old to learn this. And I think sometimes that doesn't take into account the developmental difference between a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old. And I do worry, and I have no evidence to back this up whatsoever. But one of the worries at the back of my mind is I wonder if we are consigning a whole group of children to be considered to have extra needs, partly because the education that we're trying to deliver to these children isn't suitable for their developmental stages.
Oh, that's
And
so
I think that goes
interesting.
right back to early years.
Yeah, yeah, because there has been this whole conversation about, this massive rise in EHCPs, number of people applying for EHCPs going through the roof. And there's never really, the only answer that I sort of see in the media is like parents being too pushy. And, that's a particular political narrative, basically. And I talked to another friend of mine who's a retired teacher, and she said, well, when I was teaching, we had all these extra LSAs, so those children who maybe could get by without the EHCP could do because they had all the extra support, and with all the cuts, all of that stuff's disappearing. But the fact that actually the pressure on the curriculum is also driving it, and I totally hear what you're saying, because I love telling this story, because my head teacher of my daughter's previous school said that when she was at school, she was one of the top kids in her class, and she had been having a bit of a clear out, and she'd come across some of her work. I think it was from around year 5, and she said she was looking at it. And bearing in mind she's a teacher now, so she was able to compare it to what children are doing now. And she said it was like at
Yeah,
a year 2 level, and she
yeah.
was one of the top kids in her class. So yeah, and certainly, that actually at the time made me kind of feel better because I have a child who is functioning at 5 years below the age expected levels. And it's just like, well, maybe if she'd been born a decade or two earlier, she'd actually only be a couple of years behind. But there's huge pressure, and that makes total sense that actually that is driving this demand in EHCPs, which is causing all this financial stress, which is causing all these problems for parents. Yeah, gosh, that's a real light
I
bulb
just
moment
wonder if it's
for
a
me.
factor. Like, yeah, well, like I said, I can't really point you to any research that would prove that to be true or anything like that. But when I look around at what I see that children are being expected to do, the sheer volume of content. When I speak to teachers who tell me that they feel that their curriculum subject is overloaded with content, it kind of almost stands to reason to me that there will be children that are, if the drive to raise standards is like driving a bus down the road, there will be some children that are running along the street behind the bus and will just not be able to catch up, really. And if you look at what we understand about child development in the early years, and there was a move in years gone by to push towards more play-based and creative-based learning for children. Play is learning for young children, it's important, but that goes on longer than we think it does. Play as learning doesn't stop when children suddenly hit 5 and have to go into year 1 and here's a desk and now
Mm.
can you write me 3 sentences with an adjective in or whatever it is. That doesn't stop, and children's brain development and physical development, I think, just sometimes just needs a little bit longer. And I do wonder whether some children who quite early on are identified as falling behind, are really falling behind a quite arbitrary measure of what we think children should be able to do. And if
100%.
given a little more time and just given these things to do at a more developmentally appropriate point in their life, it might turn out that they actually can do that and don't need loads and loads of special input other than time. That is absolutely not true of all children, but I think it may be the case for some. Yeah.
And would you say that it's probably the case for adopted children who have had all this additional stuff? I always say to my daughter, when she was like, "Why can't I do the things that other kids my age do?" And I said, "Well, you had so much more stuff to deal with when you were a baby. So, more time for those adopted kids, I guess, is a particular area that would help."
Well, I think this is borne out by our understanding of later educational achievement for care experienced people. The statistics on the number of care leavers, for instance, who go to university, for example, straight after school, are pretty dire. But when you look again at the statistics of adult care leavers who have been to university at any time in their lives, it's much better because what we can recognise is that for all kinds of reasons, people who've had really disrupted early childhoods or even for longer in the childhood may need to take a longer and more circuitous route to fulfilling their educational potential. But a lot of times they can get there, if the right support is in place to enable them to take those routes. And so I think we perhaps write children off too soon, by, oh well, your key stage 2 sats weren't very good, or you didn't pass the multiplication screening test when you were 8 or 9, or even your GCSE results or your your whatever exam you're taking at that kind of age weren't very good, and now you're gonna have to go to college and resit that and do a level 1 thing, but given more time. And um I think what is frequently not necessarily understood is the potential long-term impact of adversity in early childhood. This is not certainly not something that I was ever trained in, even for 1 second, when I did my teacher training. And admittedly, it was a long time ago, but we did nothing at all about child development in secondary school teacher training. And when I speak to colleagues who've trained more recently, I don't think things have changed all that much. So the tendency to see children, particularly at secondary level, as really just blank slates waiting for the fabulous information you're going to give them about your subject area is strong. Um, but actually, an understanding of what we would consider to be, in heavy inverted commas, normal child development, and then an understanding of how that can be derailed by various different impacts in children's lives is a really crucial tool for teachers to be able to understand why the lovely pedagogy they've been taught maybe isn't quite working right now for this child or this other child. We do know neuroscientifically that a young child's earliest brain development is what we call adaptive. So that means it is shaped by the environment that they are experiencing. So if really you think about a child who's experiencing a very chaotic environment, an environment where their basic needs are not consistently being met, an environment where there isn't a lot of language being spoken, maybe they spend a lot of time in a Moses basket or a cart, they're not being picked up, they're not being spoken to, you know, maybe food is inconsistently given, maybe they're left in high level of stress for long periods of time. That is the environment that their brains are adapting to. And then, of course, when you take the children out of that environment, put them in a different environment, they don't, all the behaviors seem completely out of order because they're expected to survive in a certain way, and you've put them somewhere else. It's interesting. I was watching a video from the UK Child Trauma Council just yesterday, and there was a social worker explaining a metaphor that she uses to try to explain it. And she said, imagine a child who was raised in a home at the North Pole. That child would be really adapted to living at the North Pole. You know, they would be wearing a thick coat and thermals and thick boots and hats and gloves and scarves. Now you imagine a child who lived in the hot desert, they would be really adapted to life in a hot desert. They would be used to, sunscreen, or, seeking shade, or drinking lots of water, whatever it is. And if you take the child from the North Pole and put them in the desert, and you take the child from the desert and put them in the North Pole, neither of them are going to be equipped to cope in that environment. It's not that they're wrong or broken or damaged or any of those things. It's just that the environment they have grown up to be equipped to survive in has radically changed, and they don't have the equipment, shall we say, to manage appropriately in this completely new environment. And we see this time and time again with children who've experienced adversity, that taking them from an adverse environment and putting them in a safe environment, a foster care home, or an adoptive family. Although it removes them from the adversity they're experiencing, it doesn't undo all the adaptations that they have quite rightly developed in order to survive in the environment they were existing in before. And I think
I
when it
think
comes to, yeah, go on, sorry.
I
I
was
mean, I
just
could
going to
talk about
say,
this for 2 hours. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think some professionals really struggle to understand that. In fact, I was at tribunal the other day, and they were they didn't seem to be able to get their heads around the concept that for my daughter, every adult is a threat until proved otherwise. And actually, I think it was the judge said, but surely she trusts you. And I was just like, yes, but that doesn't mean that she trusts her teacher. And she just seemed to, it was that, but surely you've just fixed her.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
just like, well,
And
no,
also
it
the
doesn't
answer
work
to
like
that
that.
would not necessarily be yes in
Yeah,
every case.
no. I mean, I didn't
Um,
really want to go into all of
no, I
that.
mean, there's a
Their
time and a
heads were
place.
exploding as it was,
Yeah.
but yeah.
I mean, even, so there've been some quite recent developments in neuroscience that really help us to explain. But one of the ones that I think is really illuminating for schools, for teachers to understand, is that when they look at brain responses of children who've been experienced to mal have been exposed to childhood maltreatment, and they show them facial expressions. So they did one where they put children in an MRI. They showed them facial expressions morphing from a neutral expression to an angry expression, or from a neutral expression to a sad expression or a happy expression. And what they found was that children who'd experienced childhood maltreatment were much quicker to spot when their face became angry looking. So they identified that as an angry face much earlier than children who'd not been exposed to maltreatment. But also, in identifying the angry face, they noticed that the amygdala in the child's brain lit up, was very active, which demonstrates a really strong emotional response, which was not present in the children who hadn't experienced childhood maltreatment. Um, and when it came to showing sad faces, the responses were very similar. So what they could see was there was a particular reactive response to angry faces, and one of the outcomes from that was that it is felt that children who've been experienced childhood maltreatment, especially violence and aggression in the home or physical abuse, are really on a hair trigger around other people's facial expressions, that facial expressions that most children would interpret as neutral,
Yes.
those
Yeah.
children are interpreting as angry faces, and they're having a
Yeah.
strong emotional threat response to what they are perceiving as an angry face.
And this
But
is what I'm finding it very hard to communicate to teachers, that they'll say, but I wasn't angry. And it's like, but you may have just had a slight
just
twitch
a
in your
slight,
face.
yeah,
She has picked up on that. Or
yeah,
you may have been, like, there was an incident the other day where the teacher was sort of getting frustrated with the whole class, and my daughter took it very personally, and the teacher was going, "But I wasn't shouting at her," and it was like, "No, but you were. There was a tone in your voice, there was an expression on your face, and that's really interesting what you were saying about the amygdala
Yeah.
lighting up, and because some teachers can get a bit like the good teachers will, go, oh, that's really interesting. I'll make note of that. But unfortunately, there are a lot of teachers out there who will just get defensive and just go, no, but I wasn't shouting.
Think talking about trauma can be difficult because I think when we talk about trauma, that really makes us think, well, maybe someone needs counselling or therapy, and I'm a teacher, I'm not a counsellor or a therapist. So I think what we're trying to explain is, look, there are very simple and basic things that teachers can pay attention to in their general practice, not just for that child, just all of the time. Be aware that your neutral facial expression will be perceived as some children but as an aggressive or frightening or angry facial expression, maybe have a think about that. Be aware that your tone of voice, although you think it is neutral, it may be perceived by children in this different way. And so moderating tone of voice, moderating facial expression, moderating the classroom environment to be as low threat as possible. It doesn't harm any child. It won't cause any problems for any children that have not been exposed to childhood maltreatment, but it may make the classroom a much more comfortable learning environment for children who have been exposed to childhood maltreatment. Um,
Yeah, I'm just wondering as well whether it could actually benefit the other children. Getting on to, we were going to talk about this sort of intersection of adoption and special educational needs. And obviously, we know a lot of adopted children are also autistic, ADHD, fetal
mm,
alcohol spectrum disorder, and but also the children are living with their birth families who aren't adopted. Um, I believe often may suffer little t what's often termed as little t traumas. So that they're just like the small everyday things of being an autistic person trying to survive in a neurotypical world. And the amount of anxiety that we see in autistic and children with ADHD. So I'm just wondering whether you think that those kind of strategies that we would use for adoption in the classroom might actually work for all children.
yeah, I mean, like I said, there are, I mean, let's lay it out. Some children will need professional psychology, counselling, therapeutic support, and that shouldn't be offered by teachers. Okay, so literally nobody wants teachers to be amateur psychiatrists. That is not a helpful thing for anyone to be. But recognizing that there are simple, sometimes cost-free, low time pressure adjustments that can be made that will not only support children who have experienced trauma of whatever kind, all right? So there are, you talked about trauma with a little t. Yes, so there are there are many ways in which a child can experience trauma. And when I talk about trauma, I am talking about the definition that is to do with an overload of a person's threat response system. So a traumatic event is one which overloads a person's threat response system. It is not subjective in that sense. It's not, well, that was traumatic to me. It's not like I don't think that's traumatic. I don't know why you've got a problem with that. Or this other person experienced that and they seem fine, so you shouldn't have a problem with that. A trauma is perceived by the individual. A trauma is something that overwhelms a person's threat response system. When children are exposed to events that overwhelm the threat response system over and over again, as we talked about earlier, their internal threat response system adapts for that environment, and so they will be more heightened in their threat response systems, and that can happen for all kinds of different reasons. I'm sure we all know children who, for instance, have had unpleasant have been unwell and have had a series of unpleasant medical interventions, and now you can't get them near the hospital or the doctor because they go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. That the mere mention of it, and we totally accept and understand where that is coming from. I think where trauma gets more difficult is when the cause of the trauma is not understood by the people who are looking on. So, well, I can't understand why anybody would be upset by X. That's just a normal part of life. But depending on your perception of X, that's where the traumatic response can come in, and you're not in control of it. You can't help it. You can't just make yourself not be traumatized by it. For example, I'm very aware that most people really love dogs and think dogs are absolutely lovely, but I'm scared of them. Um, and as a child, I was out of control scared of them, humiliatingly out of control scared of them, and couldn't do anything about it. As an adult with a fully developed prefrontal cortex, which by the way doesn't happen for most people until your mid-20s, I can use my prefrontal cortex to talk myself down from this trauma response and to regulate myself to be able to live in a world where there are lots of dogs. But children don't do that. Their prefrontal cortex is not developed yet, and their emotional drivers are incredibly strong. So yes, for all kinds of reasons, children may develop trauma responses. And understanding a trauma responsive environment to be one where people, including the adults, are physically, emotionally, and psychologically safe, where people have an appropriate amount of control over what's going on and an appropriate amount of choices. Bearing in mind, we understand this is a school environment, you can't have total control and free choices as a child, but there is some elements of that, where people's experiences and backgrounds are respected and accounted for. In the way that things are carried out, there is no one that doesn't benefit from that. Actually, there is nobody that wouldn't benefit from that. NHS England has an official sort of this is trauma informed practice document. There isn't one quite the same for schools, but schools could benefit maybe from looking at NHS England's version and seeing, how many of those core concepts of trauma informed or trauma responsive could actually apply in school at a systemic level. Rather than having to do individual interventions for individual children, but having a systemic approach to having a safe environment for children, for all children, because we don't actually know, I'll be honest, what children are experiencing. We do not know which children in our classrooms have suffered abuse necessarily. We can categorize them by care experienced or pupil premium or all these different ways we categorize them, but none of those are descriptors of the experiences that children have been through. And so taking a general trauma informed approach picks up all the children, even the invisible ones than the quiet
Yeah,
ones.
because as you said, there are children who have experienced medical trauma or
Yeah,
maybe, death of a parent, a refugee. I think we do too often just think as trauma as children who are in or have been through the care system, but actually every child can experience some kind of trauma through their
yeah,
life. We've just been through COVID, haven't we? That,
yeah.
a lot of these,
Living in severe economic stress. It
yes,
is a
yeah.
multiplicity of stressful experiences over and over again. Um, Cumulatively, this can constitute trauma for a child. So, every school will have children going through that.
Mm. So what are you hearing coming? Because I know Adoption UK do this barometer every year where you listen to parents. And what are you hearing coming up in the education world for parents at the moment? Are there some big themes that are coming out?
Yeah. So we asked parents about we've been asking parents about education for a long time. It became obvious early on that alongside um, adoption support, like so seeking specific support for issues related to adoption, education was equivalently the biggest issue facing adoptive families. What we see most recently is we've always seen a large proportion of parents saying that they feel that the impact of adverse early experiences is not well understood in education. When we've surveyed teachers, we've found that the training on this there isn't much. Excuse me. So we found also that teachers are often under-resourced and under-supported. So even when in England, for example, there is a designated teacher who previously looked after children in every maintained school, there should be in every state school, sorry, including academies. But when we speak to them about what resources, time, or training they've been given to do that role is very little, or sometimes none. And
And would
so,
you get those designated people in special schools as well?
so any, not necessarily if it's an independent
Uh,
school, not necessarily. So
but
that's
if it was like a academy special school?
yeah, should be.
It
Yeah,
should be. So
yeah.
that would be someone who could both oversee the child's learning differences and neurodivergency and their
Well, that's you see, this is an area where that role is quite difficult,
right.
because obviously within a school you'll have a Senko.
Yeah,
Um, and parents will, prior to the introduction of this designated teacher role, parents will have been used to dealing with the Senko usually, most of the time, because really the majority of previous children do have recognised special educational needs. And so most parents will be dealing with the Senko at some point. The role of the designated teacher is a difficult one because it was originally introduced as part of the corporate parenting team around the child for looked after children. So really it was meant to be an in-school representative to liaise with the local authority virtual school and to oversee the education of looked after children in the school as part of the corporate parenting team around the child. So that's been going for a while. It was extended in 2018 to include previously looked after children. But as with all these things that get extended from one group of children to another, it's not quite the same children. Their circumstances are not quite the same. They've got adoptive parents at home. It's a totally different setup. So sometimes it doesn't work as well as it could. But also in many cases, in some local authorities, when the virtual school and the designated teacher role was extended to include previous looked after children, it doubled the number of children in scope. And I really don't think it came with a doubling of the finance or the, the time available to do those
Staffing,
things.
yeah, yeah.
So it's really difficult. And I think in a lot of primary schools, especially, the designated teacher is likely to actually be the Senko or to be a
Yes,
deputy
I was
head
gonna
or
say,
even the
yeah.
head teacher.
Mm,
A small primary school might have a looked after children, one looked after child 1 year, nobody the next, an adopted child for a couple of years, and then nobody. And in the times when the designated teacher isn't actively doing that role, skills lapse, the time that they should have had for that role gets taken up with something else. And then perhaps when a child who is in scope of the role arrives in school, the teacher's got to get themselves back up to speed. They've got to like try and make space in their busy schedule to do the work that's required with that. So it's a role that is imperfect and isn't necessarily doing all of its job. I've really forgotten the question you asked me, Esther. Oh yeah, what are
It
parents
was what
seeing
were
in
the issues
school?
coming? Sorry, I
Yeah, yeah,
distracted
yeah.
you a bit.
So I
Yeah.
think what we are seeing, which is concerning for us, is an increase in parents who are removing their children from school altogether or whose children are not able to attending part-time on part-time timetables, sometimes for years and years.
Hmm.
We've seen an increase in the proportion of families who say they are home educating a child. And when I say concerning, I don't mean concerning from the point of view of home education is concerning. I am a home educator,
Did
so
it? Yeah.
but I'm saying it's concerning if families are feeling forced into a home
Yeah.
education because the child is unable to attend school or the school is not able to meet their needs or a school can't be found that can meet their child's needs. And this is also an issue that we hear time and time again that the mainstream schools um, are saying they can't meet needs, that the specialist provision isn't appropriate.
Mm.
So children, for example, who do not have autism, an autism diagnosis, being said, well, do you want to go to this autism school, school that specialises in autism? Well, I don't know. I mean, is this suitable for me? Or children going to schools for children with social, emotional, mental health difficulties. Depending on the child, it's not always like helpful for children with social, emotional, mental health difficulties to spend all day in a classroom with lots of other children with
Yes.
social, emotional, mental
Yes,
health difficulties,
absolutely.
right? So
Yeah.
it can sometimes be difficult. And what we find sometimes is children who are too special needs, excuse the terminology, but too special needs for mainstream, but not special needs enough for special
Yeah.
school,
Yeah, I
and
hear this
just are
all the
falling
time.
down the cracks over and over again.
Yeah.
And this particularly happens where children are academically reasonable,
Yes.
academically doing, acceptably.
Hmm.
We seem
Or
to,
even quite well,
or even quite well.
it's even worse.
Yeah, and I think as well there's a terrible, um, this kind of academic acceptableness is a real awful threshold for people because it is not good enough for children to do unacceptably if their capabilities that they could do exceptionally. So we,
Mm.
we shouldn't be settling for, well, we don't need to give special provision to your child because they're doing okay. If the
Mm.
child's capable of doing brilliantly with the right support, it's not good enough for them to be doing okay.
And the current government saying, we're going to be focusing on mainstream to improve the education system. And I'm just like, but how? You can't make that system work for an awful lot of children. Like, we can't just say we will just make this better and then it will all work for you because it's just, square peg, as they say.
Yeah. I
Um,
think when I was certainly first in teaching, there was a lot of pushing into inclusion and a lot of talk about inclusion and this idea that parents should be able to request a mainstream school for their child if they wanted to.
mm,
And I think at the time there was a lot of talk of thinking around, well, um, if a child is visually impaired, for instance, it shouldn't be beyond the wit of a school to make the reasonable adjustments that are required so that the child can learn in mainstream school if the parents want them to and if they want to. Um, and certainly, those adjustments were being made. And there were specialist teachers coming in I remember going to training to explain how to use the radio mics that some children had that were hearing impaired and how to manage the classroom for children who are visually impaired and those things where reasonable adjustments were really, they might be a bit inconvenient, but that's really not an excuse for not doing them.
mm,
But I think what we what we don't have an answer for is for children for where the reasonable adjustment would be probably you make the school about a tenth of its size,
Yeah.
right? Because
Get
that's
rid of
not gonna.
two-thirds of the children from the classroom.
Right, and then that's not going
Yeah.
to happen. That's not going to happen
Yeah.
in a mainstream school, and so we've got to face up to what we can provide for children for whom the learning at school is accessible to some extent,
Yeah.
and sometimes to a great extent, but for whom the environment of school is not and never will be manageable for them, and that's not a failure of them to comply or a failure of them to be resilient or whatever the buzzword is at the moment that children are all supposed to be doing, but it is just a difference in those children that needs to be
Yeah.
understood and recognised.
Mm.
So what we do know about previously looked after children in terms of SEND, and just to get into it, because I'm a bit of a data nerd, and
Yeah.
because we've recently done a Freedom of Information request for the Department for Education in England to get some data on the special educational needs and disabilities of previous looked after children in particular. And frankly, it really confirms what we'd always thought at Adoption UK from the many, many surveys and bits of research we've done among parents. But the Department for Education, through the registration for Pupil Premium Plus, so just for listeners who might not know,
Mm.
Pupil Premium Plus is additional funding that schools can attract on behalf of looked after and previously looked after children to enable them to provide additional support in regard of disadvantage they might be experiencing in school because of their adverse early experiences and care experience. So for an adopted child to attract that funding for the school, they have to be declared as an adopted child to the school. It'll go on a census, and so the government gets data returns for all the children who are declared. That won't be all the adopted children or all the children in kinship care, but it's a good proportion of them. So it's a kind of proxy for looking at what's happening with previously looked after children in schools. What we find is that previously looked after children are nearly three times as likely to have SEND as all children. Just over half of previously looked after children in schools have got identified special educational needs and disabilities, which is considerably more than the national population. What we know is that children with previously looked after children are more likely to have higher levels of special educational need. And by higher levels, what I mean is they're more likely to have an EHCP, frankly. They're more likely to have a level of need that merits an education, health, and care plan. And in fact, previously looked after children are 3.75 times more likely to have an EHCP compared to all children. Um, but we also know, and this is really interesting, that the profile of special educational needs amongst this group of children, as recorded in the census data, is very different from that of all children with SEND. And most significantly, what that really means in practice is that they have lots of social, emotional, and mental health needs. So by primary area of need, 44% of children with SEND that are previously looked after will have social, emotional, and mental health needs as their primary area of need. Now, in the general population, that would be a fifth, 20%. So they're more than double as likely to have social, emotional, mental health needs listed. Now, this is weird because what that therefore means, because obviously this is just what's been listed as their primary area of need, they're so overrepresented in social, emotional, mental health needs that they're subsequently really underrepresented in all the other areas. Our research suggests that adopted children are in the region of 2 to 3 times more likely to have autism, for example, as the
Wow.
general population. But you know that's not being put as their primary area of need.
Mm.
On the data returns, they're less likely to have autism as their primary area of need, half as likely actually to have autism as their primary area of need compared to all other children. And so what we think is happening, it's a complex picture for previous looked after children. But what we think is happening is that a number of factors are feeding into children's needs, maybe not being recognised early, and that social, emotional, mental health needs may be present, but they are also maybe co-occurring with other needs, and actually maybe a result of other needs not being identified and dealt with or supported in school. So there was a report, I think it was the Education Endowment Foundation published a report a couple of years ago now, looking at the factors that led to delayed diagnosis and assessment of special educational needs, and a lot of it was down to what school you basically went to and how proactive they were. But what they also found was that children, what I think there was a wonderful sentence that said something very similar to, in order to have the best chance of having a child's special educational needs identified, that child needs to stay in the same place and be around the same professionals for a long period of time. Now, straight away, you can see that care experienced children are not getting that. And so you've got to think about a child who, say, is adopted. Um, they may have had multiple health visitors, multiple different health professionals in and out of their lives. They may have lived in two or three different places. Those places may have been geographically distant. They may have been on a waiting list for assessments for various things at the point at which they are adopted, and then they move to another part of the country and start again on the waiting list. And so really, with the average age for a child to be adopted being around 3 to 3.5, you can see that it can almost be like there are 3 wasted years of opportunity to recognise a child's need before it gets
Mm.
properly started, when they get into a permanent home. Now, for children in kinship care, the average age for a child to get a special guardianship order is around 6 years old. So I mean, it's even more of an issue, perhaps there. Um, so we know then that previous looked after children are missing opportunities in their early lives to have their needs identified. Many of them will be going to school very shortly after they've been adopted, or within a year or two, or starting nursery, because of this average age being 3 to 3.5. With no diagnosis, with no even assessment having been done, with people not really knowing whether they've got speech language and communication difficulties necessarily, or whether they may be uh, they may even have visual impairments that have not been picked up because they've never had their eyes checked. They may have hearing impairments that have not been picked up because they've never had the hearing checked. And any number of other conditions that may be present but not noticed. Now, if you imagine starting the process of trying to get all this identified when a child is 3 or 4,
Yeah,
having no background, very little background information to go off, and then think about what the waiting lists are for accessing
yeah.
some of these services, and a child is starting those things then. So sometimes they
It's so
can.
important to get those support in place early, and yeah, I can see.
Exactly.
It's,
So you think about a child 2 or 3 years down the line, having
mm,
not been assessed for speech, language, and communication needs, as an example, or having not been picked up as maybe being on the autistic spectrum, potentially, or really seriously for care experienced children, potentially having being at risk of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which current prevalence estimates have it as being more prevalent than autism, and
mm,
especially prevalent in the care experience community, but which is
yeah,
hugely
yeah, yeah.
underdiagnosed and not
And
understood and
nobody
barely
knows what it
spoken
is.
of. No,
Yeah,
exactly. And just even think about special needs. When you're reporting special needs categories, there's a whole separate column for autism spectrum disorder, but
yeah,
fetal
yeah,
alcohol spectrum disorder, which we
yeah,
think is more prevalent, there's
yeah,
no
yeah,
way of even
yeah,
reporting that a child has got that. So, I mean, there are all these things going on. I mean, you think you're going to school every day for 2 to 3 years with maybe undiagnosed autism, undiagnosed FASD, undiagnosed speech language and communication difficulty. Is it really any wonder that you might, at the end of that 3 years, have social, emotional, and mental health needs?
yeah,
This
yeah,
really concerns me. And I think there's a big piece of work to do around supporting education professionals to understand,
yeah,
as is pretty much the case in Scotland, actually, that a care experienced child should be presumed to have additional learning needs
yeah.
until shown otherwise, to be honest.
Otherwise,
So it's
yeah.
not to tar children with some kind of brush of failure, but just to say,
Like a
considering
precaution, isn't it?
it's
Yeah,
a precautionary measure, and that fast tracking opportunities for assessment and diagnosis for these children is not jumping the queue. It is restoring what would have been their place in the queue if their early lives had not been so incredibly
yeah.
disrupted,
And
and just redressing the balance.
I remember when my daughter was young, and I just felt like people weren't really taking my concerns seriously, and I was just sort of saying, can't we just presume that it is quite likely that there's something going
Yeah.
on here, and it isn't just me like worrying too much, and yeah. But we've talked here, it's been quite a negative picture, and I do want to kind of end on a positive. So what Do you have advice for what parents can do if they find themselves in this position, whether it's, having a child whose needs haven't been diagnosed or teachers not understanding? Um, Maybe a few tips that you could
A
share,
few tips.
um, help give a bit of positivity to parents who are really struggling in this area.
The first piece of positivism that I'm going to give, and this is absolutely essential uh, for parents and actually for anybody that's care experience to also hear and know to be true, is that your history is not your destiny. What we do, and I talked a little bit about neuroscience earlier on, because I have a particular interest in neuroscience, and I'm yeah a
Me
bit
too.
nerdy about it. But one of the things that
You're a nerd.
neuroscience, yeah, a neuro nerd, yeah. But one of the things that neuroscience absolutely shows us, 100%, is that while um, exposure to childhood maltreatment and early adversity does create what they call a latent vulnerability to future difficulties. It is not a direct line drawn with a pen from adversity to future difficulty. That's not how it works. That our brains remain plastic and capable of change throughout our lives, and actually, especially in adolescence. So, adolescence is an amazing window for
Mm.
change to be made. Successive studies have demonstrated that nurturing, supportive caregiving during adolescence from parents and carers, but also from other adults in children's lives, can really help to mitigate the impacts of things that have happened in early childhood and really turn things round. So there is, statistically, as I mentioned earlier, we know that people often come back to education later in life and achieve way beyond what people said they would be capable of achieving at the time. So sometimes we just need to give people a bit more time to get through. So I want everyone to take the hope of that message that things are sometimes very difficult, and sometimes it may seem like there's no hope and there's no future, but that is both physiologically and in reality not the case. There is always hope and there is always a future. And if there are teachers listening to this podcast today, I will want to strongly say that you, as a teacher, could be the individual that is instrumental in turning a child's life round, in steering them away from these latent vulnerabilities towards a healthy and fulfilled and successful, actually, not only educational life but life in general. Will be in the quality of our relationships with children and young people that we achieve these things. And the relationships that children have with their teachers can help to make or break a child, really. So teachers can be really instrumental in that. And
But
if
as you said before, it doesn't mean that they have to be psychotherapists.
No,
Uh,
absolutely. Just in
it's just
basic
about that relationship,
relationships.
isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
just in listening, being there, acknowledging, positive
validating.
regard,
Yeah.
getting, any of that. In terms of tips and advice, okay. So I would say it's really important, I think, or really helpful for parents to have a good understanding of what's available to them in terms of being parents of care experienced children. Adoption UK can help with that. We have, I mean, not to just entirely plug us, but we do have
Go for
um,
it. Go for
we
it.
do have pages on our website with information about things like Pupil Premium Plus and virtual schools and what they can and can't do for you and designated teachers. We've literally just in the last week published a new 4-page, really easily digestible leaflet called, I think, Succeed and Thrive, I think it's called. But it's just a 4-page introduction for teachers about some of the challenges that children might face in school, why they face that, why the school environment can be so challenging, actually, for some children, and a few like really straightforward things that teachers could adjust to make life a little bit easier for them. So do go on to adoptionuk.org.uk and have a look at that. But
I
the
will
reason
put a link to that in the
Thank
description.
you. The
People
reason why
can
it's so
click it.
important to be apprised of your own rights is because within, if you're an adoptive parent, you may be part of an adoptive parent community and you know a lot of other adoptive parents, but actually there's not that many. In terms of the actual school population, there are not that many adopted and care experienced children. And so, to be honest, a lot of schools are not really always fully across what's available and what children should be entitled to. And so, if parents are able to just give the schools that information, in a very calm and matter-of-fact way, that can really help schools out in terms of getting things moving. I would not be afraid to give the Senko lots of information about early childhood trauma and neuroscience and all of that stuff. Don't be afraid to do that, but do remember that teachers are not going to read that. Even though I've written a big book, personally, I will acknowledge that most teachers are not going to have time to read that big book that you're
Yeah.
taking into
But
them.
that's why your leaflet sounds really
So
good. Yeah.
leaflets are really
Yeah.
useful with that. One of your biggest one of your biggest supports, I think, will be knowing other people who've been through it a bit earlier than you. So,
Hmm.
for example, it's really difficult to find out which of the schools local to you might be a good fit for your child. The virtual school, if you have one, will not advise you on that. For all kinds of understandable reasons, but the local population of adopters and adoptive families will know because they will have
Yeah.
had their children in and out of these schools. And so being part of local networks, whether that's on social media or in-person groups and meetups, can really valuable source of information for
I have found as well, because my daughter has a lot of special educational needs on top of, early adversity, that actually places like parents forums for children with
yeah,
special educational needs, they were able to advise me well as well.
yes,
Because actually sometimes adopted kids who have a lower level needs were actually living quite different lives to us.
yes.
So there's definitely like a crossover between, your adoption groups and your um,
Yeah, and absolutely do
special
go.
needs groups, and I think you can use all of those. I
Yeah,
found.
absolutely. Do definitely go looking at specific special needs groups, as well, especially groups that are where parenting children who have diagnoses similar to yours.
Yeah,
And I'd also say IPSI. IPSI, in fact,
yeah,
just this week
love
have
it,
published
Steve.
a little
Yeah.
article about adoption and
Oh,
parent.
have it?
Yeah, so
Yeah, no,
IPSI
I
are
think
aware of the
one
issue.
of their trainers is an adoptive parent. I went on one of their training and she disclosed that to me. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think different parents find different routes helpful. I think one of the issues that comes up often with families is either assuming that all the children's needs and difficulties must be related to their attachment and trauma problems, and ignoring the possibility the child, I don't may have autism or
Mhm.
maybe have something else, or insisting that it's all autism or something else, and
Yeah,
ignoring the child's
yeah, yeah.
attachment and trauma challenges, and that can be really difficult to do. And one of the ways, personally, in our family, one of the ways we've tried to deal with that is we actually went to the adoption agency, the regional adoption agency in my area. I asked them for an assessment of adoption support needs. Now, I am going to say this, you would feel like adoptive parents would know this, but actually not every adoptive parent knows. In England, you have a legal right to go to your regional adoption agency or your local adoption agency, if it might be your local authority, and ask for an assessment of support needs, and they have to come and assess your support needs. And what we did then was we said that our support needs were that we wanted a multidisciplinary assessment for one of
Mhm.
our children, and the regional adoption agency can apply to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund
Mhm.
for funding, specific funding to pay for a multidisciplinary assessment. And
Mhm.
what you're looking for there is a specialist who can really understand FASD, autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, trauma, attachment, and can start to help to pick apart what's going on for your child. It's not always about getting the diagnosis. Sometimes it's just about understanding
Yeah,
everything that's going on, and there is funding available for that. It's not
yeah.
quick, right? So don't
No, I
expect
was going to
it,
say
but
we should
it is
probably warn
doable.
people that I don't know if this is the same across the country, but I know in my area there can be like a 6 week waiting list just to get assessed for it. But
Yeah,
we
it's
did a
worth looking
multidisciplinary
into.
assessment, and it was the best thing we ever did. I felt I understood my daughter so much better afterwards, and yeah, highly recommend that to everyone. Yeah.
And then I think finally on that subject, I think when I speak to teachers in schools, I find them often trying to provide support that could have been paid for by the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund, you know? So the school is paying for a play therapist to come in and work with a group of children, or the school's paying for Lego therapy for a group of children. I'm not saying schools shouldn't be doing that, but where children are eligible, and this is children in kinship care with special guardianship orders, as well as children who are adopted, where children are eligible for the adoption special guardianship support fund funding, although that won't pay for education, things that should be paid for out the education budgets. It won't pay for like a dyslexia assessment, for example.
Oh, yeah,
It
yeah,
can be used to fund things that will have a knock-on positive
yeah.
effect for the child's education. And if you are going that route and you're seeking funding, encourage the social worker that's filling the form in to ensure there's space in the funding for the therapist, if you end up having a therapist, to go to the school and meet with child's teachers and discuss your child's needs in an educational setting. That is
Hmm.
within the scope of the ASGSF. It's not
Hmm.
providing education support exactly, but it
No,
is trying to ensure that staff at the school have a decent understanding of what the child's needs have been identified as being and what other support is being put in place and how they at the school could perhaps support that.
Hmm.
Or at least not accidentally do the opposite of that. I
Yeah,
go and make it work, do something that's the opposite of that. And so that can be really because what we sometimes find is that if that's not applied for in the initial application, when the parent later says, "Can this person go to school?" it means they've got to miss one of the child's therapy sessions to
yeah,
pay
yeah,
for it, and
yeah.
that doesn't need to happen if it's been built in at the beginning. So that's a bit niche, but it is a top tip I think that some might find helpful.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Becky. I will put a link to the Adoption UK website where people can get those resources. And I'm also aware that we just both talked about IPSI without explaining what IPSI is, and some people may have not have heard of it. So it's a charity that basically has volunteer legal advisors that can advise you on education issues if you're having issues with an EHCP or any kind of special educational needs support. And I will put a link to their website in the description as well. So I think that brings us to the end. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that parents have found this useful, and certainly at the end anyway have got a bit more uh, energy to go and advocate for their children.
Thanks, Esther. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay.